as promised, live to Dunedin, Florida. Let's hear from Michael Schiavo's attorney, George Felos.
My condolences to the entire Schiavo and Schindler family and all those in the country and around the world who are grieving Terry's loss. I wanted to relay to you a course of events that I witnessed. I went down along with my co-counsel Deborah Bushnell to the hospice of the Florida Suncoast, the Woodside facility, yesterday approximately 10:30, and the two of us were there continuously until we left this morning after Terry's death at approximately 11:45 a.m. today. What I didn't mention, which I can mention now, we met Mr. Schiavo at a room that he has been living in, or had lived in, for the past 14 days at the hospice facility. As I mentioned before, he's been, except for his limited media appearances, he has been with Terry continuously on since the feeding tube was removed 2 weeks ago, and he's lived at the hospice facility in a separate room just down the hall from Terry. It was evident upon first seeing Terry yesterday that she was entering into the final stages of her death process. She went through intermittent periods of rapid breathing, which I'm told is called Kussmaul breathing. She would go into periods of labored breathing. Progressively over the period of time, more than 24 hours we were there, you can see evidence of modeling on her extremities, on her hands, on her legs. That means that the heart just could not pump blood to the extremities, and the modeling were red spots. Her limbs became progressively colder, and as time went on, it was evident that Terry was going through the final stages of her death process. Throughout the first day we were there yesterday, of course we were concerned with the filings in the 11th Circuit Court of Appeal and the United States Supreme Court, and we had to address those. From Mr. Schiavo's point of view, and for all of us there, we realized that these were last-ditch legal maneuvers on the part of Terry's family, but nonetheless, you can never predict what a court may do or may not do. And it was certainly an added stress on Mr. Schiavo, and in a way cruel. No person, no family in the United States having to go through the death process for a loved one and to have a loved one on death's door should have the added worry that a panel of judges is going to order an ambulance to come, or politicians are going to take last-ditch maneuvers to try to interfere with the death process that your loved one has chosen and is almost completed. We had the opportunity. Well, let me rephrase that word. We viewed some of the media coverage when we were taking breaks over that period of time, and as you know, I haven't made a statement for a number of days. I've gotten calls from the media to respond to various developments in the case. I can just tell you that Mr. Schiavo's overriding concern here was to provide for Terry a peaceful death with dignity. And I emphasize it because this death was not for the siblings and not for the spouse and not for the parents. This was for Terry. She has a right. She has a right to die peaceably in a loving setting and with dignity, and that was his overriding concern. I don't want to, and that's one reason why we haven't made statements and haven't responded to the press the past 2 or 3 days, because we felt it was inappropriate in these circumstances, having Terry in her final death process. We did hear some things on television that were distressing. I just want to mention one of them in particular, because we did seem to see a parade of politicians and other people come in and out of the grounds in order to make statements or give their opinions. There was a priest, I believe his name was Father Pavone, who spoke on a number of occasions as the Schindler's spokesman. It was very disquieting to hear the priest issue venom and make extremely harsh statements about Mr. Schiavo, about what was going on. I know the priest mentioned he was the head of a pro-life organization, and he has a strong feeling of that. We felt that was highly inappropriate under the circumstances. I will contrast that to the words spoken by Reverend Jackson, and also in my conversations with Reverend Jackson. Although we didn't agree with Reverend Jackson's point of view about removal of Terry's artificial life support, it was evident and clear from his statements and his conversations to me that he came in good faith, in a spirit of healing, to try to bring this family together. And with Father Pavone, instead of words of reconciliation, instead of words of healing, instead of words of compassion or understanding, which you might expect from a spiritual person, we had a platform for ideological agenda. We found that very counterproductive and disquieting. As we progressed into the evening yesterday, I also want to explain that Mr. Schiavo tried to spend as much time with Mrs. Schiavo as was possible. When he was in the room visiting, when we got word from law enforcement that visitors from the Schindler family or Schindler friends wanted to visit, Mr. Schiavo promptly left the room. We all went down the hall. They came in and visited. They visited for as long as they wanted to, and when they had left, we came back up the hall to stay with Terry again. And so Mr. Schiavo tried to be as respectful as he could to the wishes of the family. As the evening progressed last night, it became more evident that we were reaching the final hours. There were times where Terry's breathing process was very labored, and at one time we thought the end might be near. A hospice worker came and repositioned Terry. It eased her breathing. Mr. Schiavo, his brother Brian, myself, and Attorney Bushnell spent the night with Mrs. Schiavo, and let me also state, throughout this entire process were literally angels of mercy of the healthcare providers, the workers of the hospice. It was just unbelievable to see the incredible amount of compassion, warmth, and love and caring and skill which they used throughout this entire process to help Mrs. Schiavo have a death with dignity. At approximately 7 this morning, we got word that the Schindler siblings, along with Father Pavone, wanted to visit. We promptly vacated the room. They were in the room from 7 o'clock to 8:45 in the morning. At approximately 8:45, we were a hospice worker, a hospice administrator came down to the room in which we were staying and mentioned that we're entering the final process. You better go and to Michael, you better go and see Terry because now may be the time. At that time, we asked whether the Schindler siblings and Father Pavone were still there, and we were told this, and I want to be very accurate about this. We were told by the hospice administrator that they requested the visitors, the Schindlers and Father Pavone, to please leave the room because the nurses, the hospice personnel, needed to do an assessment. We had no knowledge of this. We didn't request an assessment. This is the information we received from the hospice administrator. At that time, the hospice administrator said that Bobby Schindler was resistant to leaving the room and got into a argument or dispute with the law enforcement official, and suggested that he wanted to remain in the room with Mr. Schiavo and a police officer. Mr. Schiavo made the decision that that was not appropriate under the circumstances. The Schindlers had just been there for an hour and 45 minutes, and it was very disconcerting to hear that Bobby Schindler apparently had some dispute with law enforcement. I want to re-emphasize again, Mr. Schiavo's overriding concern was Mrs. Schiavo has a right and had a right to die with dignity and die in peace. She had a right to have her last and final moments on this earth be experienced by a spirit of love and not of acrimony. And Mr. Schiavo was not going to permit a potentially explosive situation, knowing that there was just a dispute with law enforcement and also the presence of a law enforcement officer at Mrs. Schiavo's deathbed at that time. Again, she deserved better, and that was the decision that Mr. Schiavo made, and I fully support it. I believe it was the appropriate decision. I want to add as well that, to our understanding, Mr. and Mrs. Schindler were nowhere near the hospice facility at that period of time. In fact, it's our understanding from what we heard on news reports that Mrs. Schindler chose not to visit or see Terry again since Easter Sunday. So at approximately, now it was 9:15, we entered Mrs. Schiavo's room. It was apparent that it was the final moments for Mrs. Schiavo. She died at approximately 9 a.m. Her husband was present by her bed, cradling her. His brother Brian was there. I was there along with Attorney Bushnell, and many workers and caregivers from the hospice of the Florida Sun Coast were there as well. Mrs. Schiavo died a calm, peaceful, and gentle death. At that time of death, approximately 9 o'clock, the people in the room stayed with her body for a period of time. We asked the hospice facility, we had asked the hospice facility how the Schindlers had wanted to be notified of Mrs. Schiavo's death. It's our understanding that they had called Mrs. Schindler, and Mrs. Schindler gave a home number and a cell phone number in which to be notified. We made absolutely no statements to the press or calls to the press or released any information until the hospice administrator informed us that they had personally not only called the Schindlers and said there's a change in Terry's condition, but waited until the Schindlers came to the hospice and were informed by the hospice personnel that Terry had died. We, at that time again, Mr. Schiavo vacated Terry's room. It's our understanding that the Schindlers spent some time with Terry's body. They were free to spend as much time as they chose with her body. After they left, the hospice workers bathed Terry's body, and Mr. Schiavo and all of us went back in to spend some more time with Terry. I also want to mention that after that, Mr. Schiavo left, having seen Terry for the last time. The medical examiner had been called to pick up Terry's body, and before Terry's body was removed from the facility, there was a gathering of at least 30, minimum 30 to 40 hospice workers who formed a circle around the body, which was now on the medical examiner's gurney before being removed from hospice. It was a very emotional scene. You have to remember that many of these hospice workers have cared for Terry for over a 5-year period. I can't describe in words their dedication. There were nurses and workers who refused to go home because at the end of their shift, Terry hadn't passed away yet and wanted to be with her when she died. The hospice workers, as well as law enforcement and the personnel from the medical examiner's office, stood around Terry. The hospice chaplain said prayers. It was a very emotional moment for many of us there. Her death process, her body was treated with the utmost care and the utmost respect, and then she was removed from the hospice by the medical examiner. That is what I wanted to relay to you, relay factually. I want to also come back to the what we've heard are angry accounts about alleged denial of the family members to be with Terry. I can just say that under the circumstances, Mr. Schiavo tried as best he could, but paramount for him was Terry and her death process. And I want to say just another word about Father Pavone. Had there been words of reconciliation, words of compassion, words of hope, words of love from him, perhaps he could have been instrumental in some sort of healing for this family. It's a tragedy. It's a tragedy that they all were not there and couldn't be there at the time of Terry's passing. And I think it's a shame that opportunity was lost, that he chose to act as an ideologue using the pulpit rather than use the pulpit for some healing in this case. So that's the statement I have to make. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Dead, how do you square the fact that you say she died with dignity when in effect she starved to death? What dignity is there in starving someone to death?
Well, I'm sure you know that that's an inaccurate question, in that patients don't starve to death from removal of artificial provision of hydration and nutrition. Let me finish. The overriding issue in this case was her choice. Whether you might disagree with the evidence or the quantum of proof or the reliability of the witnesses and whatever opinion you may have, the court, through a grueling process, found by clear and convincing evidence, through the testimony of 3 witnesses relaying 7 conversations, that Mrs. Schiavo said, "No tubes for me. I don't want to remain alive artificially." I think affording a patient their choice to die in the manner they choose is certainly a death with dignity and not something that was just described. Yes.
A lot of people have accused
Michael Schiavo killing his wife, but take us through his emotions the last final minutes, what he was feeling. You have to put more of a human spin on this, what he was feeling.
Well, I don't want to put any spin on it, and in a way, I'm reluctant because these were very personal and private moments. But I will tell you that it was evident to everyone around him, the profound emotion and loss of Mr. Schiavo. It was clear to everyone that he loved Terry deeply, and her passing was a tremendous loss for him. And believe me, that was expressed in the emotional terms that you might associate with that. Yes.
Mr. Felos, with both parties knowing that the end was near, why wasn't something worked out so that there would not be this last-minute kerfuffle, so to speak, between the families and they won't let me in, but we wanted to go in? Why was that not worked out?
You know, I don't have an exact answer for you. I mean, there are many reasons. The level of acrimony hurled at Mr. Schiavo by the Schindlers. I mean, he's been called a murderer, a wife abuser. That is not conduct and behavior that lead to reconciliation. To have your spokesman, this Father Pavano, accuse him of intolerable cruelty is not something that leads to reconciliation. I wish that some healing had occurred. Unfortunately, in this case, it didn't.
When do you expect the results of the autopsy to be made public?
It's my understanding that there are two types of results: the macroscopic and the microscopic. And that the macroscopic, which is the results of the findings that you can see in evidence and weigh, can be released very quickly. But the results that involve further testing, microscopic work, and more detailed work could take weeks to be released. Yes.
Do you have any idea, sir, how long it will take before her body can be released so Mr. Schiavo can take her home?
My understanding is that is a relatively quick process, but I don't know the specific amount of time. Yes.
Given how the final moments were spent in the hospice, is there any indication that there is any type of memorial service or funeral service that both sides would be together or something like that? Any discussion?
No, there's been no discussion of that. You have to understand that from Mr. Schiavo's side, he's been living at the hospice for the past 2 weeks, not only in the midst of his wife's death process, but fending off politicians and the United States Congress and the Governor Bush and the Department of Children and Families. So there has not, frankly, there were many times through this process where we didn't know if her death process would be completed. So we really haven't gotten, or he hasn't gotten that far. I would hope and pray that there can be some sort of reconciliation for this family. I don't know if that can happen. I hope it can.
You mentioned he was cradling her as she died. Can you go into a little bit more detail about that? And did he say anything to her?
Well, again, out of respect for the privacy of that moment, I'm not going to comment further on that.
How many people were in the room at the time, approximately?
There were, I believe, 3 or 4 hospice workers. Of course, Mr. Schiavo, his brother, myself, Ms. Bushnell, and Mrs. Schiavo.
So the police was out.
Yes.
What we're hearing about the dispute between cremation and burial.
Well, to my understanding, there is no dispute. That's a matter that has been resolved by the court. prior to Mrs. Schiavo's feeding tube, both parties presented to the court what they felt was the appropriate disposition of Mrs. Schiavo's remains, and the court ordered that a cremation would be appropriate, and so Mr. Schiavo intends to pursue that. Yes.
Are you familiar with President Bush's remarks he made after Terry's death that cemetery activists
I didn't hear the president's remarks. My understanding of what was what I've heard people relay is that basically the president said in these type of matters, when there's a dispute, we should err on the side of life. And if that is paraphrasing what the president said, it is beyond question that not only the courts of Florida but the courts of the United States of America have given tremendous deference and respect for the right of life and the sanctity of life. I can't imagine. I don't think there has been any case. Let me give you an example, because we were still filing briefs with the Second District Court of Appeal for intervention of Department of Children and Families as of yesterday morning. I filed a brief before going down to the hospice, and there have been 22 appeals just in the Florida Second District Court of Appeal in this case. Numerous applications to the Florida Supreme Court, the federal courts, the United States Supreme Court has declined to intervene at 5 times. For me, it's impossible to conceive how a fuller and fairer airing of the facts of this case and the law involved could be made. And the other thing I want to mention, we've heard a lot, we've heard the phrase a lot, the sanctity of life, respect for life, as the basis for the opponents to carrying out Terry's wishes in this case. And I would just suggest, since there seems to be a national debate and a national reflection on this, that perhaps a lot of the opposition to Mrs. Schiavo's death here had more to do with the fear of death rather than the sanctity of life.
Once
Yes.
once the body is released,
Excuse me?
once the body is released,
Yes.
is it going to be cremated immediately, or Mr. Schiavo will allow some kind of service with the family?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that
George, is there a
question.
life insurance policy for Terry Schiavo?
Not to my knowledge. I've said this before. To my understanding, Mr. Schiavo will not inherit a penny through life insurance, through intestacy, or through other means as a result of Terry's death.
George, you say to your knowledge,
Yes.
that leads me to believe that you're not 100% sure. Are you saying that there is one or there isn't one?
To my knowledge, there isn't. I know of no life insurance policy. My client knows of no life insurance policy. If John Doe in Texas got a policy out on Mrs. Schiavo's life, I don't know about it, but to our knowledge, there simply is no life insurance policy. Yes.
Do you anticipate, Mr. Felos, at any point that Michael Schiavo will be willing to talk to us?
I don't know. It's simply at this point, he's in grief. He has gone through an excruciating process involving the death of the wife he loves very much, on top of having that spotlighted around the world. I don't know what Mr. Schiavo's plans will be about speaking to any members of the media in the short term or the long term. I just know for him, as for I'm sure every other participant in this case, they need time to heal. Yes.
It sounds like, just getting back to the situation at the end there, it sounds like Michael Schiavo was angry, maybe somewhat bitter about some of the comments that were made on the Schindler side. But there are definitely people who would say, why couldn't he at this final hour just turn the other way and let a brother or a sister be there? His attorney was in the room, yet her own brother and sister were not allowed to be there. Was there ever any discussion of that? And I guess why did that happen?
Okay. Now, first let me clarify.